back to the studio. Today I'm going to be working on keeping one of my promises that I made, at least to myself. I started in one of the recent videos working on the Winter Wonderland Applique tree skirt, and before I get to the second block, I want to have my Winter Wonderland wall hanging behind me for the rest of this series. I do have my Winter Wonderland wall hanging top finished. I did that in a whole series of previous videos, and so I have that on the frame, and I'm getting ready to quilt that today. I'm going to be using the IntelliQuilter to quilt out the design because I'm using snowflakes and I want them to be as perfect as possible. One of the design decisions that I needed to make was what quilting pattern I wanted to use, and as I said, I like snowflakes. The background fabric that I used on the applique itself was a snowflake pattern. The border fabric could be a snowflake if you interpreted it that way, and the backing fabric on the back of the quilt is also a snow print fabric, which I thought was very much in keeping with the Winter Wonderland theme. On that topic, I'm wearing red like Santa Claus because I have Santa belly, so I figured that would go in there pretty well also. One of the things that in our snowflake patterns, we have several different options, and the two that I thought about were Becker's Winter Wonderland, and that was one that I really liked, and then there was also one called Snow Crystals. I have both of those two patterns. There are others as well, but those are the two that I was considering. The Snow Crystals I thought was a little too sophisticated for my particular quilt, and so I chose Winter Wonderland, which is very much in name keeping of the project itself, since it is called Winter Wonderland. So those were my design decisions for the quilting. Then there was thread. Now I will be showing probably several times me working on an Applique Elementz project using monofilament thread. But I know not everyone's crazy about monofilament, and I kind of like a little bit of color in my quilting, even if it goes over top of some of the quilting designs. So I started by trying an Invisifil thread and a Wonderfil bobbin, but for some reason I just can't get the technique of working with Invisifil on my long arm because the thread breaks a lot. I've tried adjusting the needle and the thread, the tension, the bobbin tension, the bobbin thread. I consistently have thread breaking, so I abandoned that for today. I put it aside, and I'm going to be using an Isocord thread in a light blue color. There's also Isocord in the bobbin. I will also apologize, I do have the fan on today because it's 94 degrees and it's very hot in here. So I have my Winter Wonderland tree skirt as my inspiration. I have the Winter Wonderland Christmas wall hanging on the frame, and I'll show you that in just a second, and then we're going to get to pulling up our Winter Wonderland quilting design. It's a digital design, also available as a paper panto, and then we'll get the measurements of the quilt and get that input and we can get started quilting. As you can see, we've already got the Winter Wonderland wall hanging on the frame. I'm going to go ahead and put the bottom of the quilt on the take-up lever. I have the top, batting, and backing all basted on the machine, and I've got the IntelliQuilter queued up. I haven't input my design yet, but that's what we're going to start next, and we'll see what this stitching looks like once we get started. Okay, now I have the quilt completely on the frame. I'm going to go ahead and get the pattern loaded, and we'll get this machine rocking and rolling. As you can see, I always have my machine way up to the upper left, which is where the sewing is going to start. There is a time when you're supposed to move the quilt to this, the machine to this position. I just like to do it in the beginning so I don't mess it up and do it at the wrong time. This is where the machine and the software is going to gauge the entire design from. That's my start point. So I've already put the machine there, and now it's ready to upload the design. We're at the very beginning screen, the main menu, and I'm going to select Design Sew Quilt. It's going to ask me if I want to start a new project, and yes I do. I could also open an existing project, but I don't have one loaded. Do I want to erase the work in progress? Yes, because it's a quilt I'm finished with. Am I sure? Yes. And do I want to restart my project time? Yes, because I kind of like to know how long I work on something. What we're going to do is use a pantograph for this quilt, so I'm going to select pantograph, and I'm going to enter rectangle manually. I have my measurements on paper. I measured this quilt before I put it on the frame. And so I'm going to add a little bit of space just to make sure I get it off of both edges. I have basted the edges, but I like to do this until I get really good at loading the quilt and inputting the information. I don't want it to actually stitch my edges in the border rather than off the quilt. So I'm going to enter my 56 inches. It says width 56. I'll hit continue. Enter, continue. That didn't work. And my height is going to be 68 inches. So I have that. I had to update it because I hit enter too quick. So I have my width at 56, my height at 68, and I'm finished with the measurement, and you can see roughly the quilt on the window there. I'm going to be using Wonderland, and that was in my download files because I just downloaded that. I used my USB stick to download it from the computer onto the stick and then onto the tablet. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. I'm going to use this both for even and odd rows. I'm not sure still why you would want to use two different designs on different rows, because I don't think they would interlock. But you can see clearly how we have typewriter rows here of the pantograph design, and I want to eliminate those gaps. So I'm going to hit the gap, and I'm just going to touch the screen and pull it down until I get an interlock that looks pretty good. I don't really want it to over stitch on top of itself, so that looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to touch my row height, and I understand that I should keep it around 10 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and manually input that. And that gives me what the quilt will look like with all of the stitching on it. So I'm finished inputting my panto, and I'm going to do a continuous transition type. And now I need to get to sew quilt. I'm going to use the Panto Sequency Assistance. That's going to help me input the design. And I know at the very top there's a little bit of a snowflake left that doesn't run all the way across, so that's going to be my first one. I'm going to do left to right. I'm going to tie off in between stitches, and I want to do the whole quilt, sequence the whole quilt at once. So I'm going to hit that, and you can see it sequenced the entire quilt. These blue diagonal lines are where the machine is going to go back to the start point. But I'm going to have to do a realignment after each one because I'll have to roll the quilt up. So I've got everything as I need it. You can also count how many rows you have that way. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different rows that I'm going to have to quilt before this is finished. So I'm going to go ahead and hit sew quilt. I just pulled up my thread, and now we're off to stitch. We're just getting the very tips of some of the snowflakes here. I have basted the top of the quilt so the machine isn't going to pick up any of the edges. And this is just going to be my first little tiny row. After I finish this one, I can go ahead and move to my realignment point, but I won't have to roll up the quilt since that only took a very small space. As you can see on the the design progresses from red, which is already sewn out, to green, which is where they're going to sew next. The actual crosshairs on the screen show you exactly the needle position at any given point. And I was a little concerned about the thread color because I didn't want it to detract from the applique, but I think we're going to be okay with that. It's just a light powder blue isocord that I've used on the quilting design, and we'll get a close-up of what that looks like in just a second. Because it's so hot today, I think I might have been a little bit short-tempered, and so it's a little hard getting going. The machine and the software are working as they're supposed to. It's my brain that isn't quite working as it's supposed to today. But I know I'm going to be really happy with the design once it gets finished stitching out. It just overlapped a little bit of previous stitching because I had to restart the whole design process from the beginning. And this is just an example of my learning curve on the software. If I had been using the Invisifil thread, the thread would have broken several times by now, which is why I switched over to the isocord. I like the option of using a little bit of colored thread on the quilt. It's just a traditional thing that I'm used to. When I started quilting, we didn't use a lot of the monopoly or invisible thread, so I like that little bit of color. I almost expect it. The whole process of using the IntelliQuilter is very interesting. The serial cable that runs to the X and Y motors has almost a musical essence to it in the way that it sends commands which way to move. But it's like a little musical symphony that's different on every quilt design. I don't think I mentioned how long this particular project. The remaining time for the entire quilt is 67.9 minutes. So about an hour and 10 minutes for this entire quilt to be quilted out, which is kind of nice. Especially when you consider the degree of excellence that the stitching has as far as the design carrying through. The name of this applique project was Wonderland. It was originally a Block of the Month program. You still can buy it. The blocks in the kit are still available. Some of our applique designs are also available as SVG files, so you could download those and use them on your Cameo Silhouette cutting machine or a Brother Scan and Cut, where you could utilize your own fabric. The quilting design I'm using is also called Winter Wonderland. I believe it's called Becker's Winter Wonderland, and I downloaded that from the Urban Elements website yesterday, and I have it uploaded onto my tablet. I'm using a light blue Isocord quilting thread. I also have Isocord in the bobbin, and you can see my snowflakes, which are a little heavier on the outside and lighten up a little bit on the inside. I thought that was really pretty touch to the quilt. I got a little tiny pucker on my batting up here, but I'm going to trim that off when I do my binding. I'm not sure on this design if those are meant to be little light bulbs or little leaves, little like a Christmas light, or if it's just a loop. But I love the snowflakes. The last time they had a sale at Urban Elements, I bought several Christmas designs, and I bought even a couple sets of just individual snowflakes that you could just place intermittently around a quilt without having continuous quilting. The darker border of the quilt, I think, is where the quilting shows up the most. But I love how the snowflake both fades and pops forward on the different colors, because that's kind of the feeling that you get when snow's falling. They're kind of ethereal little beings, and as I've said in the past, I don't like my quilting thread to stand out too much. You can still see the texture on the quilt with the quilting, but I want it to pop out when you get close, not when you're standing across the room. I want the actual applique to be the first thing you see when you walk in, and the quilting pattern something that you see once you get into closer examination of the quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and let you watch this stitch out for a little bit. My understanding of the process is not perfect yet. I've had a couple problems realigning the design on the quilt, but it hasn't been traumatic yet. I did overlap a little bit of my stitching on one row, but I think I've got the realignment back for the bottom half. I'm going to continue sewing and see if I can finish it without any more hitches. On the plus side, I don't use high contrast thread, so I don't think my overlap will be really evident as it's hanging on the wall. I still am mesmerized by the musical tones of the machine and the process of the design stitching out. I think I would be happy with this quilting design just on a whole cloth quilt because it's so beautiful. Just a really nice wintry fabric with the snowflakes. Well, as promised, I got the Winter Wonderland Applique quilt all quilted today. We used the Becker's Winter Wonderland quilting pattern on here, and I used very light blue isocord thread. I also used isocord thread on the back. They both were shades of light blue, and you can see that I really love the snowflakes because there's snowflakes on the background, there's snowflake on the backing fabric, and we have the entire quilt finished. And so the next thing for me to do is to get it hung, so I'm going to go ahead and take care of that now. Well, that looks pretty good. I can see I'm going to have to move some of my accessories in my table because it's a little bit larger than some of the other quilts, but I think that's okay. I think it's going to look pretty good once we get the room rearranged a little bit. I can put some of my accessories in other places and we'll get it all taken care of. So by the time you come back for our block 2 of our Winter Wonderland tree skirt, we should have everything situated. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you for stopping by today. I know it was miserably hot, at least in here it was, and I hope that you were able to endure with me as I fumbled through the muddled mind of the heat. Look forward to seeing you again next time, and have a good afternoon.